So we're in chapter 13 of your United States history book in section 4, part 2. We talked about improved transportation during this time of period between 1800 to 1850. And now we're going to talk about the improved communication. So during this time, they had better postal services. It was really important that they get communication, mail out, so that people could hear what was going on, from their relatives in the east to west or west to east, back and forth. So before the 1800s, it was hard to send a message because they had to go by journeying and basically wait until, the wagons came through, or the journey or came through the canals, or, on the ships. It would get there pretty slow. In 1800, a letter from Maine to Georgia, only Maine to Georgia, took 20 days. It's quite a while. And the cost was pretty expensive, 8 cents for 30 miles, for a letter to go 30 miles. So that the average American could only send one letter per year to their family and friends. One letter. So communication was slow, in many ways. You didn't hear about the basic news. News was hard. The news was hard to get through from long distance to see what was going on. If someone was sick or dying, you wouldn't know until many, probably months later. In 1845, the better transportation, especially of the railroad, cut the postal rates to 5 cents in 300 miles. So we're talking about 1845s now, that area. Back then, through a short period of time, the Pony Express. What a beautiful picture of the Pony Express, these guys on these ponies. They would carry the mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Now, this is before, the railroads, such. We're talking about by ponies, riding fast ponies. In April 1860 was the first Pony Express. So we're talking about 1860. And a private hired company hired some very daring riders. They had riders that could ride fast ponies, traveling at top speeds on horseback to get the mail through. And they would change riders when their horses would get totally exhausted. They would change their horses and their riders at the stations along the way. So they have these Pony Express stations. And each man would travel about 75 miles by horse, and riding as fast as he can. And then he'd be relieved by another, for the other would go 75 more miles. And the record traveled would take 8 to 9 days. And we're talking from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento. It's quite a distance. So in October of 1861, though, the Pony Express was shut down. Why? Because we would have another invention. The invention of the telegraph would get news there faster than by mail. So the Pony Express was really in operation only for 2 years, a 2-year period, which is pretty short in history, isn't it? But it was a pretty spectacular job to have, as these young men would jump on their ponies and ride as fast as they could to get the mail through, no matter if it was raining or blizzarding or whatever the weather would be. They would say, we got to get the mail through. We got to get in record times, and indeed they would do that. So, but now let's see the telegraph. Let's talk. This is the greatest advancement in the first half of the 19th century. The telegraph was invented in 1832 by Samuel Morse. He lived 1791 to 1872. And Morris was a devout Christian. He loved the Lord. He was born again. He loved the Lord. In 1832, he invented this telegraph. And he made up his own code on the telegraph by using dots and dashes. And this would be transmitted over a wire so they could get news out by using his Morse code. Here's a picture. You can see here the dots and dashes. Dots would be real quick and the dash would be long. And so they'd have these letters, A, B, C, and they could write with the dot and dashes with the Morse code. So this is 1832. So in 1850, the telegraph, he has put the telegraph together, would go from Chicago to Milwaukee because it had to be transferred by wires. They had to put the wires in. And then on also a telegraph from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. In 1860, there were 50,000 miles of telegraphs wires put in. And this outstretched east of the Rockies to the west, so the message could get there in seconds instead of days. Remember, the Pony Express was 9 days. That'd be the fastest they could get mail out. And now they could get it in seconds by these electrical wires with a telegraph. So Samuel Morse said, it is his work, and he alone could have carried me thus far through all my trials and enabled me to triumph over the obstacles, physical, moral, which opposed me. Samuel Morse. So he had a long time in getting people to really recognize his invention of this telegraph. Would later be one of the, like I said, the greatest invention in the advancement of the first whole half of 19th century. This would be the greatest achievement because it would get news out quicker in a matter of minutes. So how amazing, It says the American Leonardo, the life of Samuel B. Morse, his life. And being a Christian, he basically had a lot of trials before they would put together his telegraph. So let's talk about Morse's life here, his picture of him. So Samuel B. Morse, 1791 to 1872. He was an inventor, a painter, kind of like Leonardo da Vinci was, right? And he graduated from Yale University. He studied in England for 4 years under Washington Allston in the Royal Academy in England, and his profession was painting and sculpturing art. So he's an artist, right? So in 1832, he was interested in a hobby that he had, and this was in this telegraph system. He said how electricity could be passed by wires, and in these wires he could put forth a system of dots and dashes, his Morse code, and bring information in seconds, minutes, instead of days and months, right? And communication. So his hobby was then, and he worked long hours to perfect this telegraph. He devised this system, and it all came in his code, and he was all ready, and he approached Congress in 1838. And he wanted a grant so he could pursue this, putting in these telegraph wires, but he had to wait. Of course, he approached Congress in 1838, but he had to wait 5 years before they even responded to him. Can you imagine that? It's a great invention, and they're like, this looks like a hobby. I don't know if it's going to work, I guess. And so Congress put him off for 5 years. In 1843, Congress decided to grant him some money for an experiment to see if it even worked. So the experiment would be from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, which is not very far. So they would put forth this, this telegraph line cables. So on May 24th, 1844, the first message went over the telegraph, and it was what he put a scripture. He said, "What hath God wrought?" Meaning God had given him this, and he put forth that message, and it came through, amazingly came through. And so he was so excited. So Morse from that point was honored by Americans, and even other nations in the world looked on and say, wow, we can use this telegraph in our nations to get information out faster than ever before. So, and during his whole lifetime and all of this, and how he had to wait long periods of time and stuff, but getting it through, he always stayed strong in his faith, and he was always trusting God in everything. And God used him to bring forth the communication of the telegraph. Would later go on to the telephone, right? that cable system, so here, that's all you need to know. But Samuel B. Morse, Dynamic Christian Faith. Then the transatlantic cable had to go through if you wanted to bring telegraph across into other countries, it would have to go across the Atlantic, across the ocean, right? And so a man named Matthew Maury, and he lived in 1806 to 1873, another dynamic born-again Christian, He was an American naval officer and an oceanographer. In fact, they always called, if you think of Matthew Maury, you always think that he was the pathfinder of the seas, because he basically loved, to find the paths and to work in the seas, and he did. He spent years studying ocean winds and the ocean currents of the seas. In fact, he went by Psalm in the Bible, Psalm 8:8, that says that God was the finder of the paths of the sea. And he wanted to find the paths of the sea during this time. In 1850, he plotted out the transatlantic route for the transatlantic telegraph cable. So he would put forth these cables and put them where needed under, in the transatlantic to bring information by telegraph between America and Europe in the Atlantic. He went actually from the area of Newfoundland, which is in Canada, which is in the Americas there, and from Newfoundland to Ireland. That'd be across the Atlantic. You can see here where he went, across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland. Matthew Maury, the pathfinder of the seas. And then we have Cyrus Field, and he put in the cable. So he lived 1819 to 1892. And in 1857, he began laying cable for the telegraph that would go across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1857, he began laying the cable. In 1858, he had many, many difficulties, but completed the project. And Queen Victoria at that time sent a message to President Buchanan over telegraph after he put forth the cables. But the cable broke after a while. The cable broke, but they would have put a permanent cable in 1866. So 1858, they had the first cable, and later the permanent cable went in 1866. Steamships took 10 days to travel over the Atlantic. The telegraph message over the transatlantic cable was sent instantly. So now we have the Queen Victoria talking through the telegraph message to the President of the United States, who was Buchanan at that time. The next president would be Lincoln. But so she was sending message from England in a matter of minutes, or a matter of seconds, actually instantly, across this cable that went across the Atlantic Ocean. So how communication improved drastically, it was all because of the invention of the telegraph. And the telegraph became the very main modes of communicating, more than a letter going through. People would go and have their letters put into the Morse code and sent over on through the telegraph cables at this time. So that's it. So we will continue on to chapter 14. Oh, actually 13:5, section 5, and then on to chapter 14.